Great. I'll take POIs in the chat. And I will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I have 3 points in the speech. First on politicians, second on media, third on how this changes individuals' incentives for action and informing themselves. But before I get into that, I want to briefly discuss the model. So I think what this is most likely to look like is having an independent body will create the test. So it's not the current government. It looks like probably outsourcing this to people who have been researching general things about why people should be informed. Secondly, the test will be online and easily accessible. It will be made publicly available to as many people as possible through information campaigns in the lead up to whenever the test is being done. Thirdly, we think that we will also drop pamphlets with information so people have an easy chance to engage in the kind of information that will be on the test. I think this looks similar to what happens with like different referendums in countries abroad, where generally what happens is before the referenda, there's information shared about what kind of things could be happening in that vote. I think this will also look like sharing the kind of information that will be on the test so people have more of a chance to engage with it. Fourth, I don't think this scales infinitely, so you're not going to be able to rack up like a ton of votes. I think it looks like it being somewhere between 1 and 2 votes, not that many, just so that people have more of an incentive to get informed than they are in the status quo. Cool. Let's move on to the first point on politicians. I think there are 5 things under this. I think first of all, when politicians understand that individuals are going to be, oh, actually, I'll take the clarification. Go ahead.
Yeah, is it mandatory?
I don't think it will be. You still have the option to take the test. You can choose, but we'll try to make it as accessible as possible, so people will likely be doing it. Cool. So 5 things under politicians. First, they have an incentive to engage in political discourse better than in the status quo. I think what this looks like is when politicians understand that their most important voters, i.e. people will be able to rack up an additional vote if they know what's going on, more so than in the status quo. They have a better, a more active incentive to provide the kind of good information that means people can actually vote effectively. So in the ramp up to a election season, it looks like them actively talking about specific issues that they think are likely to be on the test as well, because they want their own voters to also know what's going on. Secondly, there's the opposite of that, which means false information is just less effective at the point where it doesn't mobilize as many people. So I think in the status quo, there's a massive problem with false information where politicians share things that aren't true to radicalize voters. I think this becomes far less effective when you have someone on the opposite side who's able to say things that are true about the general state of affairs in the world or in their own country as well. And that kind of reality is now able to ramp up more voters insofar as those kind of people are more likely to be informed. What this means is that you just get less false information, less false news, which means people are going to be voting for bad policy as often. Cool. Second thing under this, I think politicians can now discuss more minute policy details far more easily. I think also in the status quo, there's an issue where politicians just argue about headlines without actually going into the effect of what these kind of things is, because that's the only thing that they expect voters to be able to engage in. I think when politicians have the ability to know that their populace is more likely to be informed, they have to get into the more minute details of what their policies actually going to play out like, what the effect will be, and why those things are true, rather than just saying this is a broad good thing, like the Green New Deal will be great, guys, and just not actually being able to have the ability to go into the detail of it because people get bored when they hear the detail. Now their voters are more informed insofar as they're like learning about these things more often. It means that they can discuss these kind of things without that same kind of fear. Third, I think politicians just have a much bigger incentive to enfranchise voters information-wise. So they just tell them more about what is going on all the time instead of just marketing false news or just talking about things that are going to be emotionally resonant with people. Instead, considering that this is something that a test that's likely to like happen before every election season, what they're likely going to be doing is just talking about kind of general information that they think is going to be important later on, meaning more voters are likely to be encouraged to learn more as every time this is going on. Fourth, I think they have an incentive to talk about less localized issues as well. So I think if voters are being encouraged to learn more about things beyond their political circle, if we look at like what the motion says, you're also learning about foreign affairs. I think there's a problem where politicians don't feel like they can talk about the kind of effects their policy is going to have for something like foreign policy as often, because it doesn't resonate as deeply with individuals who haven't had the understanding of how this kind of policy is going to affect people outside of their immediate circle. Now politicians are able to discuss issues that don't directly affect their constituents as often because they've been because more constituents have the understanding of how their kind of policy is likely to have trickle over effects to people outside of like one specific area within a country, or just like for how their foreign policy is going to play out. In the status quo, they rely on just the largest kind of headlines to be able to talk about these things. Now they have more of an ability to go into detail on it because they understand the most important voters will need to be learning about these things. Fifthly, on accountability, I think politicians in the status quo also have the ability to know they can get away with returning to policy that had bad political outcomes because voters just don't know as much about it. Now, when you have active politicians on the opposite side of the aisle or whatever, being able to say in more specific details what the actual bad effect is and having voters more charged and able to listen to these kind of things, politicians can't get away with like going back to bad things. Now, a larger percentage of the electorate is informed, so they have to make better decisions into the future because they know that their constituents are going to understand what the policy probably looked like, what the actual effects were, rather than them just being able to say, no, I promise it was a good thing, no, I promise it was a bad thing, because you need to have those kind of specifics in order for individual voters to actually know what's going on, especially when they're not going to be directly affected by policy, but maybe affects other people within their circles. Cool. Second part of this speech, just talking about the media. I think two things under this. First of all, politicians are just more likely to put out more informative videos more often, telling their constituents far more about the world. It looks like you being on your newsfeed on Facebook during election season or whatever, and seeing like more in-depth videos about like what specific policy ramifications are, or what specific things in general are going on within the world that doesn't happen in the status quo. It's more just oriented around an individual politician and how they could be good or bad. I think the specifics of this means that individuals are going to just hear a lot more about information more often. Secondly, there are just less headlines. So it's not just politicians shouting at each other about like what a tagline of an issue is. I think now things like political debates are more specific to the actual issues because voters know what is going on and politicians know it matters to share the most minute and the most important information. So it doesn't just look like saying this thing could be good, this thing could be bad. It looks like politicians being able to get up and say more things about statistics or the facts of an issue that in general in the status quo bore voters more often. Now they know that the most important voters are going to know about those issues so they can talk about it in a more specific way, meaning that those voters are in turn going to be more informed, and also they will actually be able to know what the actual ramifications of the kind of policy is rather than the debates just looking like things being fake. I think this affects voters that are informed, but also those that don't know as much information because they're at least getting some more access to that when they don't in the status quo. Cool. Before I get into individual capacity, go ahead, Sia.
Do you think it is fair if I'm affected by a policy as much as Rachel, but I don't read the news, that Rachel gets to determine the way in which a policy impacts more than me?
I think if Rachel is going to be able to make a good decision by virtue of the fact that they have more access to information, then yes, I'll get into this individual incentives. Cool. How does this change the incentives of individual voters? First, I think people broadly care about having a say in the system. This is something that's inculcated in people in democracies from an early age. Like they say, your right to vote is really, really important. You should not give this up. When people are told then that other people are having more of a say than they are, and they actively have an incentive to try to claim that right back, to want to be able to say, no, my voice matters as much as other people. In the status quo, I think in the status quo, I think people don't exercise the right to the vote because they don't view it as important. I think because it's viewed as a negative thing. Now, when they know that they need to be able to have as much a say as other people, they do this more often. I think, secondly, what this means is that people who don't care in the status quo are more likely to enfranchise themselves more often. Secondly, I think this incentivizes good personal action because when you're informed beyond your personal circle, the same thing that this POI is getting at, you're better equipped to make better decisions on behalf of individuals. Insofar as minority citizens already are going to not be able to advocate for policy as successfully as their majority counterparts, what this looks like is those individuals now at least being able to rely on the majority to be more informed about them, to be better equipped to make decisions on their behalf if they're going to do it anyway. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now I'd like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for the Opposition bench.
Cool. Could I check that I'm audible? All right, Barry. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. The opening government have two contingencies in terms of, firstly, the behavioral change that is going to be exhibited by politicians, and second of all, some sort of energizing effect on individual voters. I'm going to take out both of these contingencies and remove opening government from this debate. In terms of the first contingency, I want to make broadly 4 notes with regards to this. Firstly, in terms of a discourse incentive, they say politicians have. Sure, they have the incentive to generate discourse. The question for opening government is to who? I'm going to posit to you that the incentive in terms of the generation and the fact that they want to spread is to those who they believe are those who are going to be able to access this information, who are going to be able to pass the test, who are going to be those who the politicians are able to get their return back from putting this information out on, at the point at which the people who are generally able to engage with views to a larger extent are those who are going to be within the elite classes. As a consequence of this, I think the incentive is that you up your engagement with them because it is considered to be less of a waste of your resources, while ignoring other people because it is a risky decision to put out information to those who you believe may not pass the test, particularly when opening government haven't even taken the burden of it being mandatory, and subsequently, I don't think these individuals access this information. Secondarily, in terms of their mechanism regarding false information, the problem is that all parties identify the problem as being the same, which is to say all parties are able to get their voters to pass the test because they all agree that we want to reduce unemployment. The problem is that one party is going to say that the solution to that is to stop having immigrants, and the other party is going to say that the solution to that is more social welfare. Both of them are telling the truth, so it is not possible to adjudicate this and pass a test based on what parties are speculatively standing over. Therefore, I think the mechanism of stopping false information does not manifest because that cannot possibly be captured by the test. Thirdly, they tell us about accountability, whereby politicians are going to be held accountable for the bad outcomes they make. Exactly. Bad to who? The problem is you are never going to be able to change the status quo because the people who benefit from the most status quo are able to hold politicians too much to account as a consequence of this, and subsequently you are denied ever being able to access systematic change. Fourthly, they tell us that you are able to use facts. People can use anything to do facts. 90% of people know that. You are able to pick out a fact whenever you want and try and use it to support the specific solution to the problem that everybody agrees upon. I do not think this has a delta. Second contingency on individual voters, in terms of the idea that you are able to claim your right back and you get energized as a consequence of it. I think the problem with this is that when you are somebody from the working class and you've spent your whole life being told that you are somebody who is not able to participate in these systems to the extent that others are, when you constantly feel the crushing despair of being locked out of participating in systems, of feeling like you are not listened to, I don't think you are going to be energized. I think you are going to fucking give up, because the task of you being able to access change has now gotten even greater, meaning that if opening government's contingency is people being energized, I think we've flipped that at the point at which this is not going to result in energy, but just despair about their status quo. Three things in the speech: why the test is constructed terribly, why even if it's a terrible idea, why this is fucking principally abhorrent. Cool. Let's talk about why the test is going to be constructed terribly. I think we broadly agree with opening government that it's legitimate for you to be able to outsource this, but what are the problems with that? One, I think you're going to probably just have it constructed by a bunch of debaters who try and have a broad movement of people constructing an aggregation of loads of different opinions. The problem with this is it's just going to make the test really fucking large and convoluted, which has two massive impacts. One, I think people are going to really struggle to pass the test unless they know about everything, because you have to try and incorporate as many things as possible within it. Don't fucking make faces at me. Secondarily, I think at the point at which you specifically have to have the test that is both large and convoluted and is not mandatory, this specifically means that you are going to lose a huge degree of voter engagement, because the test is going to be way too big for people to fucking bother with it, meaning that if opening government care about the engagement of voters, this doesn't happen when the test has to be so big to fulfill all of their metrics. Secondarily, even if it is outsourced, recognize that the current politicians and civil servants choose who they outsource it to, meaning that there is a direct incentive of those who have had it outsourced to them to try and maintain the status quo, because they want to maintain the contract that they currently have with the government, so that the government don't fuck off and give the contract to someone else. Secondarily, civil servants, even if it's not directly the government, probably will have some incentive to access a degree of stability by maintaining the status quo so they don't lose their jobs in a reshuffle. What I think this means is that the test is going to be constructed awfully, but even if it isn't, recognize that the people who possess this knowledge, due to the fact that they have a culture of discussing the news at the table with their parents, due to the fact that they have the time to read the news all the time, due to the fact that they go to debating competitions and talk about shit, it means that the people who have the low barrier of entry to being able to participate in this test are those who have the culture. It's not me who took 15 minutes to be able to name 10 heads of state yesterday, but rather it is the people who are able to read a newspaper all of the time and who have had this opinion cultivated through the fact that they went to private school and talked about it to their fucking banker parents, meaning that it is exclusively the elites who get way more votes. We do not care if it is liberal, conservative elites, because they are all pretty shit to poor people, at the point at which they access benefits from the status quo, at the point at which they are always going to critique any alternative because they have too much critical awareness about changing the status quo, and because they are safe enough that they are going to be highly risk averse and deny systematic change, meaning that you are never able to access change in the status quo, whereas the consequence of this is that the people who are most in need of change are denied access to it. The comparative of these people can mobilize, and the politicians have to cater to these groups because they have the capacity to change elections. Why is this principally abhorrent? Two reasons. One, individuals just have equal moral worth. It is not necessarily clear to me why it is ever fair for anyone to have a greater ability to change systems. And secondarily, and this is very important, it is unclear why knowledge is the determining factor that changes what your relationship with the state is. Which is to say, even though I am dumb as fuck, I still interact with the state to the same extent that somebody who is smart is. I have no idea why the knowledge that I possess is something that ought to determine my ability to influence the state and its coercive degree of power over me. Given this, I think insofar as people are all affected by the same state apparatus, it is not fair for you to deny people the ability to access this just because of the knowledge that they possess. I think this is principally fucking abhorrent, and Gov need to defend this.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech, and I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government.
I've been muted this entire time. Sorry. And I was just ordering away. Sorry, I was just ordering notes. Before I start, one note for Jason. I apologize for having a face. What happened is I was thinking my face reflects emotions. I know I'm neurodivergent. I apologize that my face doesn't reflect the emotions you have. I do think, however, your response was quite rude. You might want to not do that in future. Okay, having said that, I'll now move on. I've got all my papers here. I turned my camera on to offer a POI, Jason, is what happened, and you immediately responded. Like, you'd know I offered a POI in chat, turned my camera on and raised my hand.
Is this something we need to pause and discuss, or are we going to continue?
Okay, like, if my face was something that was interpreted in a way I didn't mean it, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to make a face at you. I was just thinking, but I also think your response, given that you projected what you thought of that face onto me and were quite rude about it, was inappropriate. I'm willing to take some culpability here. I just think that you should also do the same.
Yeah.
And at that point, I'm willing to drop this. Okay. Sorry, can I just have a second to take a sip of coffee and get a breather after that?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll get started in 3, 2, 1. Broadly, 5 things in the speech. I'm going to deal with both of the responses that Jason gives to Emery. I don't think they are successful. I'd also note we're not contingent on just those 2 things, so they don't take out all of Emery's case, but I think, Ron, I trust you and the panel to get that. Then I'll talk about the reason they give why the test will be bad. I think this is just mech bashing. Then I'll talk about accessibility and who is likely to succeed. Finally, I'll deal with the state power principle in up to 5 ways, depending on how much time I have. But I will note that I don't think Jason makes the principle completely. Rather, he just posits that people have equal moral worth, and he thinks it's abhorrent for people to not be given the vote. I don't care what Jason thinks, because he doesn't prove that the average informed voter ought to think this. He just posits it. That is not an argument. Before that, then, let's do the responses to Jason on Emery. Let's talk about discourse incentives first. Jason says 3 things here. 1, he says that the only reason you have, as a politician, to give people information is those who access that information, the people who are likely to access that information, are the people you should target. 2 responses to this. 1, to a large degree, this is the status quo in terms of how politicians allocate information, and so there's not a large amount of change there. I would, however, posit that all of the stuff Emery says about why these people are likely to vote in the interest of other people more than they do themselves, because they're more aware of what happens to other people, because politicians have less of an incentive to hide it, to the degree the test doesn't just reflect the interests of that group, aren't responded to in terms of how that discourse changes. Secondly, though, I don't just think this is a motion that applies to elites for a couple of reasons. A, the MEC literally makes this widely available, i.e. we're dropping pamphlets everywhere, lots of people have easy accessibility. Notice this isn't a pass-fail test, but rather one that scales between 1 and 2 votes based on performance, meaning that you could always optimize by talking to people outside of the group who score 2s, by just getting more to the people who score like 1.5s, and those people aren't just going to be the elite to the degree we're pamphleting. Secondly, to the degree Emery gives you a map as to why it is easy to access information from politicians, i.e. they're often posting videos online, they're popping up on your Facebook feed, and you are basically everyone is at some point passively scrolling through their Facebook feed and sees these videos to some degree. It is likely that literally everyone to some extent is able to learn from this information. It's not a time-intensive activity. In fact, it is a thing that happens on your commute to work. And let's face it, people in the working class have a long time in their commute to work. Often they're going to be accessing this information to a large extent. The second thing Jason says in response to this is it's not possible to pass on objective truth to deal with false information because you're able to disagree on how policy outcomes might actualize. Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think the kind of objective truth you might access, though, is, for example, how many people are dependent on food banks if you're talking about welfare and how to solve it, i.e. there are objective truths that do underlie those issues. Those are the things that are likely to be on the test. And the point is that the false information you are dealing with are just the politicians who objectively lie. I think Jason strawmans what it is for false information to exist in the status quo. That is the problem that we deal with. Thirdly, Jason said extent that there's no degree of accountability because people will just vote for the same party. I don't think this is true to the extent that they know where that party has failed them. That is, people tend to vote for the same party because they believe in certain policy outcomes being valuable. Parties stand for those policy outcomes, and when those policy outcomes aren't realized, they are able to get away with not actually being held accountable to those voters because those voters don't understand that the reason those policy outcomes weren't actualized early within the government of that party was just because of a policy failure, because they lacked the information. To the degree that they are now more informed on political goings on within the last 4 years, say, of their electoral cycle, they are more likely to hold voters accountable, parties accountable. This is a marginal change that is a win for government. Next, let me talk about enfranchisement. The claim here from OO is that the working class are likely to be locked out. I have 2 comments on this. One, I think this is contingent on the claim that the working class are to some extent dumb, because to the degree they're dropped information regularly, and they do have the capacity to learn it, they are likely to actually access this information and therefore get votes. This means the mechanism of seeing that you never get to vote as much as other people never accrues, because at the point where you are likely to some extent pass this test, you are getting those votes, and therefore the long-term narrative mechanism Jason gives drops out of the debate at the very first point. The second thing I'd like to say, though, is this is also contingent on feeling you can't be represented. No, you always have at least one vote, and to the degree your vote counts at least half as much as someone else's vote, and people are likely to vote with you to some extent because they're now more aware of your issues, you do feel like your vote can matter. I would posit more than in the status quo, because typically these groups are locked out to a large extent in the status quo anyway. To the extent that more powerful groups who are electorally determinative vote more with them now, you probably actually feel more enfranchised rather than less. Let's talk about the test next. 2 things Jason says here. 1, bad people make the test. I just think this is mech bashing, i.e. fact checkers do exist. I'll take a POI like 545. Fact checkers do exist. For example, on Facebook, they are chosen fairly independently. News outlets exist. Specialist information exists. We're obviously not going to be picking debaters. I think this is incredibly unkind. There are people who have specialisms in evaluating information in electoral cycles. These are the people we're choosing. Secondly, Jason says politicians will choose who's on the body. I think this is just beaten by the MEC that says it's independent, i.e. there are many independent regulatory bodies that determine elections that face strict regulatory standards on who can be appointed to them, meaning politicians can't just appoint who they want in order to get a free cycle. The MEC takes this out. Next, let's talk about who succeeds on this test and accessibility. To the degree that I've already argued why it is likely that this is incredibly accessible, especially because there is a 2-vote maximum, meaning presumably also the amount of information needed on this test isn't incredibly large. You don't need to study for hours and hours, you just need a basic amount of information in order to reach the 2-vote thing. I do think this is easily accessible and large numbers of people can succeed. What that means is I just don't think this can be debate winning, because it's not a significant shift in electoral outcomes in the status quo, to the extent that often the people they're saying are failing are disenfranchised anyway. Comparatively, they are more enfranchised on Gov, especially given that they perceive that the capacity to vote is important to them. That is, even if they don't choose to exercise that vote because individual politicians don't represent them, the capacity to have voters is inculcated in us from an early age to be important, meaning they are more likely to become educated on political issues just to be able to exercise that right. Actually, now's a good time to take a POI. I'll take CO. CO?
What do you think is the actual harm of someone who does not know as much as someone else voting?
All the things that Emery highlighted, i.e. you're likely to vote for bad policy issues, you're likely to be failed by false information, you're less likely to hold politicians accountable, politicians make worse policy making, you don't care about outcomes of other people, you should listen to our case, we said this. Okay, let's deal with the state power principle next. 5 observations here. 1, on the COPOI, you never vote for one policy, you vote for a raft of policies and they affect lots of other people as well, meaning to the degree that you affect other people, fairness to you on one policy doesn't matter. In fact, I would contest that to the degree your votes affect other people, they coerce other people as well. That is, the outcomes of your votes enact the power of the state upon other people who didn't vote for that thing. That means when you leverage your votes, you are coercing them, and therefore you have a duty to do that in a way that leads good outcomes, at least as far as you can. That means you have a duty to be informed about the way you vote, and if you aren't fulfilling that duty, I think there is a moral difference between you and someone who is fulfilling that duty, and therefore they do principally deserve more votes. This means that the burden, not that you are owed a vote, but you are owed an equal number of votes to anyone else, fails on op, and therefore this principle is incomplete. Secondly, though, the thing you are owed is not the ability to vote, but rather control over the state, to the degree that the state coerces you. If you aren't controlling the state because you don't understand the outcomes that you are voting for, and you are being hoodwinked, you are not reasonably exercising that control, meaning we fulfill this principle better at the point where the state educates people more, and therefore they are more able to exercise meaningful control over the state, and politicians give them options better. Thirdly, though, the thing that is taken from you is your conception of the good life. 2 things to note here. 1, people in foreign countries can't vote. You should represent them better. You get information to do that more. Secondly, though, to the degree that other people have their conception stolen too, and you represent them more, you are representing their rights better as well. The state power principle falls on Gov and not op in this debate, as does everything else. Proud to stand in OG.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for opening opposition.
Can you hear me?
And indeed.
Cool. I think the problem with opening government, and I will take a few away from closing government, but I think they'll fall into this too, is a misunderstanding that knowledge of a topic does not translate to how you vote on that topic. Knowledge of statistics does not necessarily mean you understand the importance of them. I want to do something. I don't like being the Irish girl who does this, but during the abortion referendum in Ireland, do you want to know who knew the most statistics about how many girls flew over to England and how much it impacted their lives? People who voted no, because people who want to maintain the status quo and people who want to maintain laws that keep people down and keep people oppressed are quite knowledgeable on facts and statistics. And yes, opening government wants to say no, but the problem with status quo is people lie. Okay, yeah, Trump lies, right? Cool. The problem is that, like, the Tories don't often lie. They use specific statistics and lead themselves to moral conclusions from those statistics. Because the reality is a lot of policies and a lot of votes are moral weigh-ups based on facts that some people know and some people don't. So regardless of, even if opening government, and I'll prove why I don't think they do, but even if opening government want to say, look, we get more people informed, they don't necessarily ever prove that that ultimately leads to good policy and policy that we think is legitimate and policy that we want to stand over. What am I going to, actually I'm just going to talk through that main claim really for 7 minutes. Sorry, I'll try and flag point as I go through it. Okay, look, the first speech triggered me a little bit. More important voters. What the hell is a more important voter, right? You can look at that in two ways, I want to say. Firstly, you want to look at it in more important, i.e. which voter is likely to get that politician success. I think what that looks like, as Jason has already pointed out, is entrenching into your already existing voter bases. What does that mean? It means like not bothering as much to engage with the issues of those who currently are disenfranchised by your party. Why so? Because if you can just ensure that your current voters, when you have the lead status quo, get double the vote, you are still going to win. You forget that there is a massive difference between 2 votes and 1.5 votes when you times that by the millions of people who vote in a country. The difference is, right, and obviously this is different depending on what political system you're in, whether or not you have, like, I don't know, some people get voted in on party basis, some people get voted in on individual politician basis. But either way, it still holds true that at the point where certain people have double the amount of votes of others, it cancels out the minority votes in that country. Why is that true, right? I think that information does not lead to enfranchisement at the point where facts and statistics still don't lead to the outcome that is necessary. What is that meaning, right? I think information can be skewed. It can still be true that a government can release facts to say, look, we have made our healthcare system more efficient. We saw 90% of children who came into our ER within 20 minutes. And that sounds lovely. And that is true. But the reality very often there can be the cost of that was that they didn't see people who needed it more. And they didn't give money to disabled people who needed more attention, because efficiency isn't always equitable. Efficiency very often leaves people left behind. And I think at the point where statistics can hide the failings of the state and you are testing based on knowledge of those statistics and understandings of those facts, you are losing this debate. The second way I think you can interpret, I will text you later, you don't need to keep your hand up the whole time just in case it's hurting you or anything. I think that at the point you want to say important voters, you come down to this idea that voters have equal worth. And yes, Jason said it and didn't give it 7 minutes of analysis, but like he said it, he didn't backload it, he said it, right? A couple of things on this. Equal worth, equal value, all right? The state is only legit, and this actually directly deals with Reese's analysis on this, right? Because Reese says, look, your control is only legitimate at the point where it's genuine control and you're not being hoodwinked. I think that my control is legitimate if I want to be a one policy sort of voter. What does that mean? If my oppression is the most important thing in my life and I want to ensure that there's legal abortion and safe abortion for me in my country, it shouldn't matter if I know the political workings and the economic output of like whatever, insert Irish economics. See, I don't know it, right? Like the important thing is I still matter as a voter. Why so? Because the state as an organization is a manifestation of the will of individuals. You therefore are only legitimate at the point where individuals are represented and equally capable of engaging with that state. The problem there is, for this debate to have a government, you have to concede that some people will have twice the amount of vote of others. That is therefore not an equal vote and not equal representation. The burden to be a legitimate voter with legitimate engagement is literally being an individual, because the state is an aggregation of the will of individuals. At the point where you want to determine what will is more important than other people, that is why we have votes and elections, and people can say if they're happy with policy, because the last reason that opening government put this on is to say no, because the more informed people will vote for good policy. This is an intuition pump, but I just think it's true. The people who create the policy often are the most politically informed, know the most about current affairs, know the most about politics, and will probably score 2 on this because it's their job, it's their life. But they come up with really backward, fucked up policies a lot of the time. And I don't necessarily think that they're like, the David Cameron being able to get a 2 on this is a good thing for disabled people in the UK when he changed what it meant to be disabled. Jess or Aniket, go.
How did disenfranchised people get empowered on your side?
You vote, you aggregate, you change, you have the equal amount of vote. And the problem here is, this is where Jason comes to, right? Change is messy, right? Change is problematic. Change very often requires a new policy or a new set of rules and a changing of the system that currently exists. And the people who will score well on this test and get double the amount of vote are likely to be risk averse and likely to be happy with the status quo. Why is that true? I think the ability to remember all of these facts, engage with all of these facts and do well will be linked to the fact that this is part of your history, all the things Jason said, that you have critical thinking skills and stuff like that. The problem there is opening government think that that's a good thing because they think that'll lead to good policy. No, these are people who equally apply their critical thinking to new opportunities, but do so harsher, right? Because when you are unsure of the outcome, you are more likely to be risk averse because you are able to go, oh, this could reduce my standing status quo and I don't want to take that risk and I don't want to change that policy. The difference is those who are already not happy with the system are happy to take the risk because they want change. They want to pursue that benefit for themselves in a more equal society. The problem is you are less likely to get that at the point where the most disenfranchised are locked out of this. And again, it comes back to opening government saying, look, no, you can read it on the train to work. Like, I used to sleep on my hour commute to work because I was so tired from standing for 10 hours. But even if I did have time to read that, right, I think at the level, if that is it and you are literally only having to read a pamphlet, then this either means everybody passes and you get no benefit, or you have to concede our case, to which some people will do a lot better. And regardless of who they are and what their political opinion is, that's an unequal system and a system we cannot stand over.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech. Thank you to both top half teams for an excellent debate thus far. So now I'd like to invite the Member of Government to extend the case for the government bench.
Cool. I assume I'm audible. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's just get straight into it. How will this test be constructed? I would just make an observation that it just seems very reasonable that governments are likely to consult with civil society groups, educators. This is likely to go through a series of testing. This is how government policy is made all the time. Jason's assertion that it'll just be made by debaters is not good enough in this debate and belies the realistic way in which governments make policy all the time. I want to make 2 observations about the opening opposition case before getting into our extension. The first is that most of their case is somewhat marginal, i.e., oh, you can still distort outcomes. Yes, but this is a comparative debate about what is better. Just because politicians can still mislead people sometimes does not mean that it is still not better than the alternative. But secondly, they also defend a status quo that has failed so many disenfranchised voters all over the world. Simply saying people have the means to go out and vote now is insufficient, given that status quo in the developing world and also the developing world has often failed people. Okay, I want to talk about educational improvements at the moment, because the problem with the opening government mechanisms is it kind of presupposes a level of education. They talk about mechanisms like videos, being able to put out more complex information as a politician, but this kind of misses the link which opening opposition points out, which is that you don't understand a foreign policy snippet if you don't have the educational attainment in the first place to be able to digest that information, right? You need reading proficiency to be able to understand what politicians put out in the first place yet. So that is a missing link. And we also would observe that whilst the individual incentive to educate yourself that opening government talk about is good, unfortunately, if individuals lack some means to do so, it is, an imperfect mechanism. What do we think are better mechanisms on our side? Firstly, we think civil society groups are likely to do things like outreach in terms of civics classes, etc. While they have an incentive to do that at the moment, it is very, very difficult to see the return because often your policy intentions just do not manifest into outcomes, right? This gives them a far clearer incentive to do that because the policy aims that they are likely to care about will now be manifested far more clearly if they can educate people that also believe in those policy outcomes to then educate themselves and vote in turn. The second mechanism, though, is political parties generally, not individual politicians like opening government say. And opening opposition's response to this is that you won't do this because you don't want to risk targeting the wrong groups. This is obviously silly because you know who your base is. So like Republicans can target their base and Democrats can target their base. That means that then educational attainment rises in general. It doesn't really matter who your base is. It'll kind of generally be covered across the board. The third incentive is states or different types of governments. Now, I want to be like realistic. I recognize that this context is not applicable everywhere, but in many, many cases, it is national bodies that are likely to control the electoral system, but local or state systems which control education. Now, they have an incentive to make sure their voting populace has the capacity to cast more votes. Because if you're Iowa, you don't want to be left behind. You do not want, the fact that you have dumb people in your state reflecting the fact that then your state does not get any capacity to control political systems. Maybe that's not the best example in an electoral college state, but it also applies to many parts of the developing world and so on. And note that this is an apolitical incentive. It does not matter like what your political party is. And I want to note an observation that opening government don't make, which is that many elections do come down to margins, very small margins. So even a couple extra votes per person is quite significant here. Opening opposition say you feel despair, you do not have the energy to be able to do this yourself. That's fine because the groups that I've identified and talked about earlier are likely to do this for you. Why is this material important? One, it actually solves a missing link in opening government. Two, it also produces a macro benefit that goes beyond just election cycles. Educational attainment helps you in many other ways, your ability to navigate a job market, your ability to understand things. And third, I think it deals with opening opposition's quibbles. I want to now briefly talk about poor people, and after this, I want to take a POI from closing opposition. I think this is actually on balance likely to help the most oppressed individual society for a couple reasons. One, just on net, there are more of them. There are probably more people who are like poorer and middle class than people who are rich, right? So even if on balance, like people who are more educated, if there's some correlation between rich people and people who are educated, maybe they are going to do a little bit better at this test, fine, but there are less of them. So if we get on balance more poor people, even if like it's not perfect and not all of them are able to engage with them, there are just more of them. So it's probably likely to better reflect their outcomes. But secondly, this is just on balance the easiest way compared to other mechanisms and other things which tend to oppress poor people in society. It is very difficult to solve things like campaign finance because that system is just broken. It is very difficult to get rid of things like gerrymandering and voter ID laws, which typically oppress those members of society. This is just, for the reasons I've given you earlier, just a comparatively easier way of being able to engage with these groups. I want to now take a POI from closing opposition if they have one. No, opening up. What do you got?
At the point where you still haven't proven that this leads to votes, which leads to change, which leads to positive outcomes, even if you can pretend you can fiat in education cells, which takes generations upon generations, you don't actually prove that this improves voting or it's legitimate.
Yeah, so I'm going to do legitimacy in a moment. Two, yeah, it's not perfect, doesn't happen overnight, but it happens, and it's not fiat because I've provided structural reasons for that happening, and then they're likely to vote in turn. Okay, let's now principally defend this. I want to make 5 observations here. Firstly, democracy is about adjudicating subjective trade-offs. The point is, though, your preference works better the more you know about things to be able to determine it. So if you've got less information, then the ability to actualize your preference is reduced as a result. Second observation, democracy is always constructed somewhat arbitrarily. The electoral college, first past the post, first proportional representation. The fact is it is always constructed in a way that best necessitates what is best for the state, which leads me to my third observation, which is that if this produces better outcomes on net, people would likely pick it. Like, to give you the generic thought experiment, if I said, here you have a choice, £50, take it or leave it, or if I just give you £100, you would probably prefer the latter. If this produces on net better outcomes for elections, but also educational attainment in general, it is likely to be something that people prioritize. My fourth observation is that opening opposition makes a default assumption that you're all affected equally. The point is, though, if you don't all care equally, why should you have one vote? This system somewhat reflects the intensity of your preference. If you care about democracy, you'll probably make at least some effort to educate yourself. The fifth observation I make is that there is some reciprocity that I think the state demands. The state does a lot for you, and I think it is somewhat reasonable to expect in turn that you are somewhat educated to be able to vote for the things that the state gives you. I think we have filled in a huge amount of mechanistic material. We've provided the biggest macro benefit in this debate, and we've principally defended it, responding to the opening opposition qualms. That is why we've won this debate.
I thank the member of government for that fine speech. And now I'd like to invite the member of opposition, although I'd like to remind first, if Irene is here, to pause the recording at this point.
That'll be a record of me talking about democracy forever. Fun times. Okay. Cool. Oh. Oh dear. Okay, give me one sec. I just need to. Cool. Okay.
I'm going to need you to start soon.
Yeah. Sorry. I just need to sort some papers out. Cool. Starting 3, 2, 1. It's an unfortunate reality of modern politics that on both sides of the House, poor people are the ones who are least listened to. But what Jess is able to demonstrate is that insofar as you get some increase in these people being listened to, because they're able to gain access to education, because their votes are able to count for more, that's able to account for lots of this discrepancy, and you do actually get meaningful change. The point that's worth noting here is it doesn't have to be everybody, which deals with the challenges that we got from closing opposition. But if it's at least some people, that's probably likely to be debate winning. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on the extension. Secondly, responding to OO, and I'll save CO for last because they're basically OO with like 1 or 2 marginal additions. On the extension, what Jess is able to prove is that essentially educational attainment is likely to be significantly better for a whole host of reasons, because of the reasons of civil society and like NGOs which exist, but also more importantly, and a mechanism that wasn't dealt with at all, because the fact that insofar as states want to be listened to, they want to ensure their voters do actually have an important accounting in the national election, which means they're likely to provide education in a lot better way. This isn't US dependent, right? A bunch of countries have federal control of education system. That's true in Germany, that's true in India, etc. So it's actually a massively applicable mechanism which applies. Yeah, I'll take OO at like 6-ish. The problem here is that you don't know what will happen with these votes overall, but like at the very least, you get some degree of spillover effects from learning more about education. The response that we get to this from Rachel is basically some people can't do this classes because they have 3 different jobs. Firstly, I don't think this is every single person, at least there's some group who are going to have access to this. But secondly, insofar as civil society groups who are like good actors doing this, that means they're probably like to ensure that you can work these classes around your other jobs that you might have. Like presumably these people are relatively altruistic. They've chosen to work for these sorts of NGO groups, which means they're likely to do it in the best possible way. Thirdly, because the difference is that status quo on their side of the house is still incredibly horrific for these particular individuals, and they have to defend like status quo which doesn't particularly work. As I said before, outside the house, if we even get marginal change of more education, we're actually able to win. It's not all people, it's not perfect, but even insofar as it's a relatively big group, that's enough to change elections, because Jess is able to prove that elections are often incredibly close. Why is this material debate winning? Firstly, insofar as policy is subjective, we don't know whether inequality, for instance, is a more important goal than reducing unemployment or that sort of thing. We don't really know how to prioritize these things. But the point is that insofar as people are educated more about these issues, they then know more about what they actually think about this, rather than just their intuitive gut gut reaction. They could then support it with particular reasons. So we're not saying we don't know how these people are going to vote, but at least they're going to vote in a way that more reflects their own preferences. But secondly, autonomy collapses into utility for the reasons that Jess proves. She gives you the intuition pump about, taking £100, etc. But I would also note that democracy doesn't prioritize autonomy overall. It just prioritizes autonomy of the majority. Like even in their best case, 49% of people still have their autonomy undermined. What that means then is that we ought to prioritize ensuring that people have the best possible outcomes overall, and that we get that on our side of the house. Thirdly, insofar as the rich already dominate and we get less of this sort of thing, that's able to be meaningfully important. But lastly, everything else in this debate about electoral outcomes is incredibly uncertain. We literally don't know how people are going to vote, and we probably can't predict the outcomes. At the very least, the educational benefits that Jess gives you have spillover effects in terms of ensuring that you know more about current affairs. You can use that in job interviews or something like this, which has a spillover effect directly on people's lives rather than the relatively uncertain impact of electoral politics. Secondly, on opening opposition, the first claim is that the test is likely to be done badly because of cultural high bars, and it's going to exclude poor people. The first thing is, I don't think this test is likely to be politically biased, because the Nash equilibrium type thing going on here, right? That's say, insofar as political parties compete and they lose elections to their opposition for reasons separate to this test, you might preside over an economic crisis or something, what that's likely to mean is they aren't going to do the test in the worst possible way to exclude the opposition party supporters, because they know that when that opposition party then comes to power, it will be a tit for tat retaliation, and they're likely to do the same thing, which means the test is likely to be relatively neutral. But secondly, I think the point of the test is to read into sketchy statistics, and you can challenge things like £350 million a week, etc. Their main claim, though, is that oppressed people are likely to get harmed. The first response here is to say that unfortunately, just a reality of democratic politics is that marginalized people are dispossessed on both sides, and they have the least, they have the least polling stations or stuff like this. They think that all politicians are incredibly unrepresentative, and they're generally right. In the UK, in a political choice between, Tony Blair or the Conservatives, it's basically the same. In the US, Clinton basically continued Reagan's policies. So what that means is that these people don't really have a meaningful choice on both sides of the house, and it's unclear how they get enfranchised on their side. And it's likely that this is true because these politicians tend to come from elite backgrounds. They need funding from campaign finance groups, and turnout is lowest for the reasons of learned helplessness, which Jason describes. The best way of going about this to solve this is doing things like protest politics, for instance, but that's not really in the debate. I would observe this doesn't flip the point, but it proves that they don't get solvency by just saying, oh, you get votes on your side of the house. I think the flip, though, is Jess's material about oppressed people. We just say, on our side of the house, when you're able to learn about people's preferences a lot more, and you're able to get this particular education, your vote then counts for a lot more, and you can actually act within the system in a lot better way than you do on the comparative. Before I explain why it's important, Jason.
So the CG case is self-defeating because if you concede this is long-term, poor people are denied access in the short term, and the parties whose base of support is elite entrench themselves. The education
I don't think it's self-defeating, because I think it happens on education of these particular things can happen in 1 or 2 years. I would also observe election cycles are quite long-term. The next election is generally in 5 years. So I think that impact does actually manifest. I don't get that POI. But this also responds to Lucy's principled thing about individuals having equal wills. I would observe that actually no, the state doesn't affect every individual equally. If I'm a minority person who's affected by a police brutality, then that probably matters to me a lot more than if I'm an upper middle class person. And I observe that you can at least get your preferences manifested in some way. You have an incentive to learn about these things to ensure that your votes count for more. Lastly, on closing opposition, essentially what they say is just opening opposition repeated. Their one contribution is single issue voters, which I think Lucy already said. What I would say to this is that if you're a single issue voter who actually cares deeply about a particular issue, I think that what this motion is like to mean is that you're likely to read more widely, right? Because you want to ensure that your single issue preference is manifested. So if it's true that, for instance, you're a single issue voter on tuition fees, you'll just want to read more broadly to ensure that your 2 votes get particularly counted for that if you're motivated exclusively by that. So if that's true, I just think that these people get more information on our side of the house, and that's a good thing for all the spillover effects that Jess said. Look, this debate has basically been quite messy, but I think that Jess's benefits exist independent of uncertain electoral mechanisms, and even on those uncertain electoral mechanisms, she at least proves more information. Very proud to stand in closing government.